I'm Jen Doherty. We probably met at check-in this morning. I am on the marketing team with ICF, so a part of Fred's team who you saw earlier. So our thank you to Karsten for our great keynote. Hopefully we'll have as many questions for all of our presenters as we did for him. So next is Daniel Obadia. He comes to us today from Integration New Media all the way in Montreal. So he's part of the AEM development team there, crafting beautifully responsive websites from the ground up. And he's presenting today on making AEM fit accessibility requirements. So here we go, Daniel, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to Making AEM Fit Accessibility Requirements. It was a quick flight from Montreal here, so I'm glad to be here and to speak with everybody and kind of have an awesome next 2 days. So as I said, a little bit more about me. My name is Daniel Obadia. I am an AEM 6.0 certified developer. I love popular CMSs, such as WordPress and Drupal. And I have a strong emphasis on author and user experience. I think it's one of the most important things that you need to offer to your clients. You really want them to be able to create those websites really easily. And I love staying up to date with emerging technology. I think that in our industry where, if you kind of close your eyes for a second, you get left behind. So I really try to stay up to date with all the things that are happening. So one of the things that I thought about when I was creating these slides was, if I was a developer sitting in your spot, and there was this guy in front of me talking about accessibility, this was the face that I was going to have. Now, I would probably be hungry more than bored. The usual talks on accessibility is really telling developers what you're not doing and what you need to do in your projects. So I kind of talk a little bit about the legislations and all the different regulations that you need to follow. But we also have some interesting stuff that we added within AEM to make it more accessible for authors and easier for them to test their components. So our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about AEM. I promise it's not very long. Then we're going to talk about what is AODA, ADA, and WCAG. Present to you our project and kind of what AEM and accessibility comes out of the box with. Then what did our client ask for, and what did we have to change or add in AEM to make it accessible? How we approach the project, and at the end we'll have a small session for Q&A. So AEM is a small company out of Montreal. We were founded in 1989 with over 200 clients across the globe. We're a strong Adobe AEM partner with a diverse team that has a strong emphasis on technology and engineering practices. We work directly with clients as well as agency support when really that technical muscle is required. Our mission as an organization is to balance each project in 3 key areas. We first look at business objectives. What is the desired result and the impact of the work that we're doing? Then we look at key performance metrics and build for the end result. We look at user experience and design for optimal engagement. We focus on author experience, as I mentioned before, is one of the most important things in AEM, so we really try to make it, that experience for them really great. And something that is quite unique to our company is that we have an engineering background which really helps adding all these processes and continuous integration systems within each project. So if I told you that almost everyone here is disabled or will be at some time, would you believe me? I mean, we're all getting older, aren't we? Unfortunately. For example, as you can see, I'm wearing glasses. I was born with a lot of issues, and I have 2 operations on my eyes, actually, when I was born. And often you'll see me, when my colleagues are kind of showing me something on their computer, I'll be fiddling around with their settings, increasing font size, and looking at, increasing the brightness of the screen. So if you really think about it, there might be something on your end as well that you kind of play around with, and this is really an accessibility tool that the OS is providing you. So a little bit on web accessibility legislations and guidelines. There's mostly what we're going to be talking about today is the regulations out of the Canadian standards, but these are very much in line with the North American ones. So ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's pretty much the same, and they're primarily for federal government projects. I have a link there for you that you can check, all the different guidelines that exist, and you can send me an email at the end, or we can chit-chat in the next few days, and I can send you the link via email, not a problem. So other examples of accessibility around the world is that there's the Disability Discriminations Act of 1992 in the Australian government, and the Web Accessibility Code of Practice for the UK, as well as the Spanish Accessibility Guidelines that track very closely to the WCAG standards. So the important note about all of these standards and guidelines is that their principles are the same. They all follow WCAG and W3C standards. We'll talk a little bit more about what these are in the coming slides. So, AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Basically, all the private and public sector websites need to be fully accessible WCAG AA by January 1st, 2025. Now, what does that mean for us developers? Well, we need to look at making all these public and large organization websites fully accessible and compliant with WCAG AA. Four of the main principles of WCAG is, for one, you have to look at making your website perceivable. So you have to provide alternative texts, and you have to test with assistive technologies such as JAWS on Windows and VoiceOver on Mac. And you need to provide audio transcripts. These are just small examples of things that you can do. You have to make it operable, so you have to navigate with your keyboard. This is actually very easy. You can launch VoiceOver on your Mac. It takes you through a 10-minute quick start, and you'll be navigating through your whole OS, your whole website, with your keyboard, and then you can really look at what are those components that are breaking the site or that are not allowing users to really continue looking through the content. You have to eliminate blinking and eliminate redirects and other content changes. It also has to be understandable. So your pages need to have lang attributes if they're all in English, for example. But if your authors will be entering sections within that page that is in French, then you need to allow them to select that language and to change the language attribute for that particular section so that when VoiceOver or JAWS kind of goes through it, then it understands the language and switches automatically. You need to identify page focus points, and some of the tools that we use for that was the Bootstrap Accessibility plugin. It's very, very good with these focus points. You have to look at having consistent functionality across pages. You don't want users to have to relearn every page that they're navigating to. You need to provide video captions and a clear definition of user inputs and error messages. Imagine a user that has filled out a 30-input form, and all of a sudden they have an error. They can't submit it, and it doesn't tell them which input has an error. Where do they find it if they can't see it? It also has to be robust. So it has to support plugins, scripts, and applets from current and future user agents. So you need to look at content within them, such as PDFs and PowerPoints. It needs to be accessible. And if it's not, or you can't make it accessible, then you have to provide alternatives. So it does sound like a lot of work, doesn't it? Well, is it really valuable for your project? I mean, usually everybody just overlooks it, right? Well, it does reduce risk of legal action and negative image. One of the examples is that Expedia was actually sued in 2009 because their website was inaccessible to users that wanted to book a hotel just by using assistive technologies. It gives you public relation benefits, so it shows a corporate social responsibility. And it overlaps with other best practices. You can be happy like your little guy on the bottom right there in SEO, mobile web design, and usability. So what was our project? Our project was a website for an Ontarian provincial government department. The site has significant traffic every 3 to 4 years and minimal government traffic in the other periods. Accessibility was a key motivation, so it needed to be WCAG 2.0 AA. And AEM was the chosen platform. Then we thought, well, they need to migrate all this old content within AEM, all these pages, all of these components. how are we going to make it fully accessible for them? Well, we first started looking at AEM and accessibility. We had a strong assumption that many of the elements were accessible out of the box, and they are, but not fully with CAG 2.0 AA. So many things did need modification. A quick tip for you is that in Adobe's documentation for accessibility, they actually don't recommend AAA. So just in case you're looking at that. And I actually have a bit.ly link for you there for the accessibility documentation. Again, if you don't have a chance to write it down, I'll be glad to email it to you. So the client asked for layouts, templates, the actual design, and the structure needed to be fully tested with AODA AA and with CAG AA. And we thought, well, how are we going to check for this? Well, achecker.ca is actually a government-approved accessibility checker, and that had to provide 0 errors. The site had to be tested with screen readers, such as JAWS and VoiceOver, as I mentioned before, and include an accessibility notice. So we actually created an accessibility component, notice component, for those rare times when they needed to use an HTML component or something like that, and once they tested it, they really couldn't find an alternative. So they needed to provide the user with a notice that the following content was inaccessible. The site's users must also have access to an accessibility link that allowed them to change the whole design and overall look of the website, from font face to font size to letter spacing. So what did we end up integrating was an accessibility dashboard. And here you have a small preview of it. So basically the way it works is that you have a choice of style. You choose everything, as I mentioned, the letter spacing, all these different color designs, and that is saved in a cookie. That cookie is then assigned as a CSS class to the HTML, and those CSS classes already have preloaded CSS, right? So if I wanted to choose the high contrast, for example, the class is already existent in the CSS, and the whole page changes accordingly. It also provided a small preview area so I can preview my changes before even having to commit to it. And here's an example of the homepage. This is what it looks like regularly. And if I were to choose high contrast, this is what it would change to. So how did we approach the project? To achieve these accessibility requirements, I&M had to ensure that all the components used by authors were compliant. So every component that was created and developed had to go through all of this testing. All the templates included properties and options that authors needed to fill in. So we actually had to override the page creation wizard and add all these extra fields that are required for them to even have to create a page. All the AEM default components that were not compliant were hidden from authors. So for example, the default table component, we noticed that there were a couple of issues with it, and we hid it, and I'll actually be talking about that a little bit later. And achecker was integrated directly into the AEM authoring environment. So this allowed authors the ability to test their page without even having to publish it at all. So how did we do that? Well, we had to override the page information dropdown to add our custom button that would then open a modal and do all these different things. There's a Java Sling servlet in the back end talking to the achecker server, and this is actually the homepage of achecker.ca, so it's pretty much the same like any W3C page where you give it the URL or you copy paste the HTML. So how are they going to check their page if they're an author? Then they need to publish it and it might be inaccessible, right? Well, this is what we did. So we overrode as I said, the dropdown, and that kind of opened up a modal which talked to an achecker server, local or achecker.ca, which is public, and returned the errors of the page. So we actually strip out everything that is author environment around the code and just send the real HTML code that will be shown in the published server. We also provided them with an OSGI config node that allowed them to, be able to configure wherever this server was going to live. What are some of the things that we had to change? As I mentioned before, the tables. In the accessibility documentation that Adobe provides, they actually recommend that authors go into the source of the WYSIWYG and kind of add all these different attributes. we didn't think that was great for an author. So we upgraded the WYSIWYG plugin, and this allowed us to install tables, accessibility plugins, etc., that allowed authors to have fields for captions, fill out the summary attribute, the scope attribute in order to associate header cells with data cells. We also noticed that the radio buttons and checkboxes were missing field set legends. So this was not available out of the box, and we kind of had to modify it a little bit. And we overrode the layout helper class in order to add the required text for input fields that were required. It was previously just a little star. Area labels were not available out of the box. So there's this standard on area attributes. For form elements, you look at adding area required equals true or false. And these were not available, so we actually did have to add those. The text component out of the box, this is AEM 6.0, was generating B and I tags, which doesn't really work well with screen readers. So there was a small HTML rules node that was missing that kind of configured the WYSIWYG InTouch UI to generate strong and EM tags. We also integrated the latest version of reCAPTCHA from Google. So if you remember the regular old version, you kind of had to listen to an audio, and it wasn't really clear even to us. That could, we can all see. Even the letters didn't really make sense to us. So the new version is just a checkbox. It uses the Google's own algorithms, and all the user has to do is check the checkbox, and it does its own thing. So that's pretty much it for my presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Yep, sure.
So when you said you have a page level dialog that basically opens up and does the validation.
Yep.
What is the action that allows this dialog to come up? Is it that the authors have to explicitly click on certain things, or is it part of an automated system like a workflow process that shows up this dialog? Like, for example, is it possible the authors could bypass the accessibility check?
Yes, so the responsibility does go to the authors. It's not automated at all. So part of the authoring documentation was that authors, before even being able to publish the site, they had to test it. Now they could do it. They could publish the page without having to check it. So usually, all the components that we built were accessible, so there wouldn't be big issues. But for those rare cases, we allowed them to test the page before having to publish it. I think you had another question? I'll put this. I can put the slides on SlideShare, and for package share, yes, we can look into that for sure. Just maybe send me an email or something after, and we'll look at it. Yes, yes. Okay, great. For package share, for sure, yes, yes. Anybody else? Yep. There are a couple of tools that exist.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry. Repeat the question.
Your question was if for ADA, if there was similar tool to AcheckR. I'm not exactly sure. I believe there are a couple of them that exist out there. AcheckR basically uses W3C, so it does all the requests to W3C for HTML checking and all these different things. So I would highly recommend it for that. I'm not exactly sure for the US what is the officially approved checker tool.
So I believe you guys are providing some components which are accessible, right? If I understand correctly, the AEM is providing. Let's say I'm not building a brand new site. Okay, the example that you gave, Expedia. So if I want to keeping the same branding, and do you have any kind of components or CSS or anything like that that can keep the branding but still make it accessible?
So your question is basically how do you keep the branding even with allowing users to change the whole layout and look and feel of the website?
Using your whatever you provide.
So this is one of the things that we were looking at directly with the client. what happens, when the users change the background color of all these different things. And what we ended up doing is that all the color variations are actually in line with their design. So their logo has a couple of colors, and we actually use these colors to allow the accessibility dashboard that I showed you change to all these three colors. So all their design guidelines were kept.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
Hi. Does your work, was your author environment only in the Coral interface, or did you also have some work in the classic UI? Or you're not using classic UI at all?
There was, for those rare cases, in 6.0, there was a couple of things that were still not implemented in Touch UI. So everything that we did was Touch UI. That's really what Adobe is pushing for. I think, they really want everybody to work with Touch UI. So all that you saw and everything that we did was Touch UI, yeah.
And for your table, the table component, were you using the...
That was classic UI.
That
yes.
was classic
Yes.
UI. And so your doc type for your HTML, is that HTML5 or is it XHTML 1.
HTML5.
HTML5.
Yep.
So,
I think another question.
This is more of a general accessibility question, I think. The rules that you had on one of your first slides, was that the content couldn't change after the page loaded? Is that right?
What do you mean, sorry?
One of the guidelines for being compliant was that your page's content couldn't change after it had
Yes.
finished loading?
So when you look at carousels, for example, right? They kind of have this animation. Carousels are horrible for assistive technologies.
Right.
It just gets completely lost, and it's in this list that kind of changes. Kind of like that, or if you're doing any custom jQuery or JavaScript that dynamically changes content.
Does that so we do a lot of like AJAX requests to load data
Sure.
after the page loads. It doesn't change after that. Would that still be compliant or no?
Yes, that would be compliant as long as it's in the DOM. You're good to go. You really just don't want it to be, a user clicks on a random button and then all of a sudden the data that they were reading changes.
Okay.
But if it is preloaded, there's no problem.
And what about like UI widgets like tabs? Is that a no-no then?
Yes, so tabs and things like collapsible items, accordions and stuff like that, I actually recommend that you look at the Bootstrap accessibility plugin.
Mm-hmm.
It helps a lot with these things. One of the things that a lot of people do is for collapsible elements, they'll do like an ahref or a span, and then they'll add that action to that span element, right? One of the things that I noticed when I was testing was that when you're using VoiceOver on Mac or JAWS or really anything, if it's not a button, then the action item won't execute. So the actual HTML needs to be a button with that action added to it.
I see.
Yep.
Anybody else? Great, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, we have another break, and then we're coming back with a presentation with two presenters on our app and developing in AEM apps. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes or so. Thanks.